Imagine standing on the muddy banks of a river, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. All around you are simple wooden huts, their roofs patched with reed. Night falls quickly here, and out beyond the firelight, you can almost sense the watchful eyes of neighboring tribes. No one feels truly safe. At this point in history, survival is a daily challenge. But now, fast forward in your mind. Picture the stone arches of the Colosseum rising above the city, the rhythmic flow of water coursing through aqueducts, the endless roads stretching far beyond the horizon, tying together lands and peoples. It feels almost impossible that this mighty city, the heart of a civilization that would change the world, began as little more than a cluster of huts on these muddy shores. So what made Rome different? What is it that allows a civilization to endure for centuries, outlast its enemies, and leave a mark so deep that the world still speaks its name? Was it simply luck, careful strategy, or perhaps something deeper, rooted in the spirit of its people? Today, I want to invite you on a journey to discover how a forgotten trading post on the Tiber River became the legendary city of Rome. This is not just a story about kings and battles. It is a tale of ambition, of sacrifice, and of clever decisions made in the face of overwhelming odds. There were moments of fear and times when hope seemed to flicker out, but there were also flashes of brilliance that would change everything. Here's a fun fact you might not know. The very name Rome might come from an old Etruscan word for river. Before the marble temples and mighty armies, its people were more likely to be shepherds and salt traders than warriors. Salt was so precious in those days that it was used as money, which is actually where we get the word salary today. So if you find yourself drawn to stories of transformation, of people rising beyond what anyone thought possible, you're in the right place. Stay with me as we explore how a handful of huts became the eternal city. And maybe, along the way, we'll find lessons for our own lives, too. And hey, if you love epic stories as much as I do, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. Hit the bell so you never miss our next adventure through time. Picture this. It's the 8th century before Christ, and you're standing on a muddy hill overlooking the Tiber River. All around you, the landscape buzzes with tension and opportunity. This isn't just any river valley. This is the crossroads of ancient Italy, where three powerful peoples are locked in a constant struggle for control. The Etruscans dominate the north with their mysterious language and advanced metalworking. To the east, the fierce Sabines guard their mountain territories. And scattered throughout the region, various Latin tribes compete for the best farmland and trading routes. Right here, where the Tiber bends and narrows, creating a perfect crossing point, someone had the audacity to build a settlement. They called it Rome. But here's where history gets fascinating. Every great civilization needs its founding story, and Rome's is absolutely wild. The legend tells us that twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, were abandoned as babies and raised by a she-wolf in these very hills. When they grew up, they decided to found a city, but they couldn't agree on where to build it. In a fit of rage, Romulus killed his brother and became Rome's first king. Now, you might think this is just ancient mythology, but here's what makes it incredible. This violent, primal story actually captures something profound about Rome's character. The she-wolf wasn't just a random symbol. Wolves are survivors, predators who adapt to any environment. They're fiercely protective of their pack, but they're also opportunistic hunters who will take any advantage they can get. Sound familiar? The Romans themselves seem to understand this connection. For centuries, they embraced their wolfish nature, fierce, loyal to their own, but absolutely ruthless with their enemies. They weren't ashamed of their rough beginnings. They were proud of them. Archaeological evidence paints a picture that's actually just as compelling as the myth. Imagine tiny oval huts made of mud, wood, and thatch scattered across the Palatine Hill. These weren't impressive structures. A strong wind could probably knock them down. But the people who built them were incredibly clever about one thing: location. You see, the Tiber River wasn't just water. It was money flowing past their doorstep. Every trader moving salt from the coastal marshes to the inland tribes had to cross here. Salt was so valuable in ancient times that people literally fought wars over it. The word salary comes from the Latin word for salt, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in this precious mineral. But controlling a river crossing means you're also painting a target on your back. Every neighboring tribe sees you getting rich from their trade routes, and they start getting ideas. The early Romans were surrounded by peoples who had every reason to wipe them out. And here's where the story gets really interesting. There might be a grain of truth in that name, Rome itself. Some scholars believe it comes from rumen, an Etruscan word meaning river. Think about what that suggests. Maybe the Etruscans were here first, and these Latin settlers were actually the newcomers, gradually taking over an existing trading post. Picture those early Romans, huddled in their mud huts, watching Etruscan merchants with their fine bronze goods, their sophisticated art, their knowledge of writing and engineering. The Romans were basically the poor country cousins in this neighborhood. But they had something their more civilized neighbors lacked. They were absolutely desperate to survive, and they were willing to do whatever it took. Every morning, they woke up knowing that any day could bring raiders from the hills, floods from the river, or disease from the marshes. This wasn't a place for the weak or the comfortable. Only the most adaptable, the most cunning, the most ruthlessly practical people could thrive here. And maybe that's the real secret of Rome's incredible rise. They didn't start with advantages. They started with nothing but mud, determination, and a perfect spot to watch the world go by. From their humble riverside perch, they learned to read people, to understand what made different tribes tick, to spot opportunities that others missed. Those tiny huts on the Palatine would eventually give way to marble palaces that amazed the ancient world. But the spirit that built those first shelters, that wolfish combination of loyalty, cunning, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up, that spirit would carry Rome from a muddy trading post to mastery of the known world. Now imagine you're one of those early Romans, and you wake up every morning wondering if today's the day your neighbors decide you've gotten too successful for your own good. Because that's exactly the situation Rome found itself in during those crucial early centuries. The Etruscans looked south from their hilltop cities and saw these Latin upstarts getting rich off river trade that used to flow through Etruscan territory. The Sabines watched from their mountain strongholds as Roman merchants grew bolder, venturing into routes they'd controlled for generations. Even other Latin tribes started viewing Rome with suspicion. After all, why should one muddy settlement get to control the best crossing point on the Tiber? Picture the scene. Roman sentries, scanning the horizon at dawn, looking for the telltale dust clouds that meant raiders were coming. Women and children ready to flee to the safety of the hills at a moment's notice. Every harvest season brought the same terrible question. Would they be able to bring in their crops before someone decided to burn their fields? But here's where the Romans revealed something extraordinary about their character. Instead of just building higher walls or hiding behind their river, they made a decision that would change the course of history. They decided to learn from everyone who tried to destroy them. When Etruscan warriors attacked with their sophisticated bronze weapons and disciplined formations, the Romans didn't just fight back. They studied every move. After the battle, they'd examine captured Etruscan shields, trying to understand the metalworking techniques. They'd question prisoners about battle tactics and training methods. Most other tribes would simply drive off invaders and consider the matter closed. Not the Romans. They had this incredible ability to swallow their pride and admit when someone else knew something they didn't. Imagine being a young Roman warrior, returning from a brutal fight where Etruscan tactics had nearly overwhelmed your forces. Instead of boasting about your survival, you'd find yourself in long discussions with the elders, mapping out enemy formations on the ground with sticks and stones, trying to figure out how to adapt those same strategies for Roman use. This wasn't just military wisdom. It was cultural absorption on a massive scale. Roman religion started incorporating Etruscan gods. Roman architecture began reflecting Etruscan building techniques. Even the Roman alphabet evolved from Etruscan script. They were like cultural sponges, soaking up anything useful from anyone who crossed their path. But the most revolutionary idea they developed was something that sounds simple, but was absolutely radical for its time. Instead of just conquering their enemies, they offered to make them family. Think about how most ancient conflicts worked. You win, you take their land, maybe you enslave the survivors, and you move on. The Romans looked at this system and said, what if we tried something completely different? When they defeated a neighboring tribe, they'd send envoys with an incredible offer. Keep your customs, keep your local leaders, but become Roman citizens and fight alongside us in the next war. This was mind-blowing to ancient peoples. Citizenship was supposed to be a sacred inheritance, passed down through bloodlines. The Greeks would never dream of making a barbarian into a Greek citizen. The Etruscans kept their citizenship exclusive to their own people. But the Romans? They were handing out citizenship like it was a recruitment bonus, and it worked like magic. Suddenly, instead of having to constantly watch their backs for revenge attacks, the Romans found themselves with enthusiastic allies who had a real stake in Roman success. These new citizens weren't just mercenaries fighting for pay. They were fighting for their own future, their own families, their own piece of Roman prosperity. The genius of this strategy became crystal clear during Rome's first major test as a regional power, the war against Alba Longa in the 7th century before Christ. Alba Longa wasn't just any enemy. It was the mother city of the Latin tribes, the settlement that all other Latin towns looked to for leadership. If Rome could defeat Alba Longa, they'd essentially become the new leaders of the Latin world. But here's what made this conflict so fascinating. It wasn't won through superior numbers or better weapons. According to legend, the two cities agreed to settle their dispute through single combat. 3 brothers from each side would fight, and the winning city would rule over the losing one. The story goes that Rome's champions, the Hieraci brothers, faced Alba Longa's Curiati brothers in a fight that seemed hopeless for Rome. 2 Roman brothers fell quickly, leaving 1 Roman against 3 wounded, but still fighting Alban warriors. Instead of accepting defeat, this last Roman brother used his brain. He pretended to retreat, causing his enemies to chase him at different speeds, according to their wounds. Then he turned and picked them off one by one. Whether this story is literally true or not, it captures something essential about the Roman character that was emerging during these early centuries. They were learning that victory didn't always go to the strongest or the bravest. It went to the smartest, the most adaptable, the most willing to try something completely unexpected. After defeating Alba Longa, Rome didn't just celebrate and go home. They made the Albans an offer they couldn't refuse. Join us, bring your gods and your customs and your families, and together we'll be stronger than we ever were apart. The Alban population was absorbed into Roman society so completely that within a generation you couldn't tell who had been Roman and who had been Alban. This victory sent shockwaves throughout central Italy. Here was this upstart river settlement that had just absorbed the most prestigious Latin city without destroying it, without enslaving its people, without even really humiliating them. Other tribes started looking at Rome with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What would it mean to be conquered by people who turned their enemies into family members? The Romans had discovered something that would carry them from their muddy hills to mastery of the Mediterranean. The secret wasn't just to survive their enemies, but to make their enemies want to become Roman. It was a strategy so brilliant, so counterintuitive, that it would baffle and defeat much more sophisticated civilizations for centuries to come. By the 6th century before Christ, Rome had grown from that humble trading post into something that would have amazed those early mud hut dwellers. The city now sprawled across multiple hills, with stone buildings, bustling markets, and a population that mixed original Romans with absorbed neighbors from dozens of conquered settlements. But success, as it often does, had bred its own problems. The Roman kings had become intoxicated with their own power. What started as practical leadership had evolved into something much more dangerous: absolute rule. And nowhere was this more evident than in Rome's last king, a man whose very name would become synonymous with tyranny, Tarquin the Proud. Picture Tarquin in his palace, surrounded by luxury that would have been unimaginable to Rome's founders. He wore purple robes imported from distant lands, ate from golden plates, and demanded that Roman citizens bow before him like subjects before a god. This wasn't the rough, practical leadership that had built Rome. This was the kind of decadent monarchy that the Romans had learned to despise in their neighbors. But Tarquin's real mistake wasn't his arrogance. It was forgetting the fundamental Roman principle that had made their rise possible: respect for the community that had chosen to follow you. He began treating Roman citizens like conquered peoples, imposing heavy taxes to fund his building projects, forcing families to send their sons to work on his monuments, ruling through fear rather than earning loyalty. The breaking point came in 509 before Christ, and it involved a tragedy that would echo through Roman consciousness for centuries. The story centers on a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia, whose personal honor became the symbol of everything Romans felt their king had destroyed. When Tarquin's son violated the sacred trust that should exist between ruler and citizen, Lucretia's response became the spark that ignited a revolution. Rather than suffer in silence, Lucretia called together the leading men of Rome and told them exactly what had happened. Then, declaring that her honor and Rome's honor were inseparable, she took her own life as a protest against royal tyranny. Her last words, according to legend, were a challenge. If you truly are Romans, prove it by ending this monarchy that has forgotten what Rome means. The revolution that followed wasn't just about removing one bad king. It was about Romans rediscovering their identity. Led by men like Lucius Junius Brutus, they didn't just drive out Tarquin and his family. They made a collective vow that would define Roman politics for the next 5 centuries. Never again would one man hold absolute power in Rome. But here's what makes this moment so fascinating. Instead of descending into chaos or simply choosing a new king, the Romans invented something that had never been tried before. They created a system where power would be shared, checked, and constantly rotated among the citizens themselves. They called it the Republic, from the Latin words meaning the public thing, because government would belong to the people, not to any individual ruler. At the top, they placed 2 consuls, elected for just 1 year, each with the power to overrule the other. Below them, they established a Senate filled with former magistrates whose job was to guide policy through wisdom and experience. Think about how revolutionary this was. Most ancient peoples believed that kings ruled by divine right, that the gods themselves chose who should hold power. The Romans looked at that idea and said, what if the gods actually want us to choose our own leaders? It was a leap of faith that would influence political thinking for thousands of years. But creating a new system of government was easier than making it work fairly for everyone. Almost immediately, Rome discovered that getting rid of kings didn't automatically solve the problem of inequality and injustice. The city was divided into 2 distinct classes that might as well have been living in different worlds. The patricians were the old families, the descendants of Rome's original settlers and early allies. They owned most of the land, controlled most of the wealth, and considered themselves the natural leaders of Roman society. Then there were the plebeians, everyone else: craftsmen, traders, small farmers, former slaves who had earned their freedom, and people from conquered towns who had become Roman citizens. Here's what's incredible about this conflict. It nearly destroyed Rome just as the city was reaching the height of its regional power. The plebeians looked around and realized that while they made up the majority of Rome's population and provided most of its soldiers, they had almost no say in how the city was governed. Patricians held all the major offices, controlled all the courts, and even kept the laws secret so that ordinary citizens couldn't know their rights. The tension reached a boiling point in the 5th century before Christ when the plebeians made a decision that stunned the patrician elite. They went on strike. Not just from their jobs, but from the entire Roman system. They marched out of the city in a massive group and set up their own settlement on a nearby hill, declaring that if Rome didn't want their participation as equals, it could try to survive without them entirely. Picture the panic in patrician households as they realized what this meant. No craftsmen to make tools and weapons. No small farmers to grow food. No ordinary soldiers to defend the city. The patricians quickly discovered that all their noble birth and ancient privileges meant nothing if they couldn't convince the majority of Romans to participate in Roman society. The plebeians weren't just making demands. They were proving a point about what Rome really was. This wasn't a city that belonged to a few old families. It was a community that had grown strong by including people from many backgrounds. If Rome was going to continue its remarkable rise, it needed to live up to its own principles of turning former enemies into loyal citizens. The resolution came through negotiation and compromise, resulting in one of the most important legal developments in human history: the 12 Tables, Rome's first written code of laws. For the first time, every Roman citizen could know exactly what the law said, what punishments applied to different crimes, and what rights they possessed. These weren't just legal documents. They were a declaration that Roman law would apply equally to patrician and plebeian alike. A wealthy senator and a poor craftsman would face the same penalties for the same crimes. Property rights would be protected regardless of social class. Marriage and family relationships would be governed by clear public rules that couldn't be changed on a whim. But here's a fascinating detail that shows how practical the Romans were. They didn't just write these laws down once and declare them eternal. The 12 Tables included procedures for how laws could be changed, how new situations could be addressed, and how the Roman people themselves could participate in shaping their legal system over time. What emerged from this internal crisis was something unprecedented in the ancient world. A society that was both hierarchical and democratic, traditional and innovative, proud of its past, but willing to adapt for its future. The Romans had learned that their greatest strength wasn't their military tactics or their engineering skills. It was their ability to create systems that allowed very different kinds of people to work together toward common goals. And speaking of bringing different people together, here's one of the most remarkable stories from Rome's early days that shows just how desperate and creative these early Romans were. In the city's earliest years, they faced a problem that threatened their very survival. There simply weren't enough women to sustain a growing population. The solution they came up with was bold, controversial, and surprisingly effective. They invited the neighboring Sabine people to a great festival, and during the celebration, Roman men carried off Sabine women to be their wives. This led to the legendary War of the Sabines. But here's the twist. The conflict ended not with military victory, but with the Sabine women themselves intervening, declaring that they had grown to love their Roman husbands and wanted the two peoples to unite as one. Whether this story is historically accurate or not, it captures something essential about Roman character. They were willing to take enormous risks and try unconventional solutions when their survival was at stake, and they had this remarkable ability to turn conflicts into opportunities for growth and inclusion. From a practical monarchy to a revolutionary republic, from internal near collapse to legal innovation, Rome was learning the most important lesson of all, that their strength came not from avoiding change, but from managing it wisely. They were becoming a people who could reinvent themselves without losing their essential identity, a skill that would serve them well as they prepared to take on the entire Mediterranean world. Did you know that the Romans kidnapped women from neighboring tribes to populate the city? This sparked the legendary Sabine War. If you're enjoying this, leave a like and comment. Would you have survived in ancient Rome? And don't forget to subscribe to the Legacy of Empires channel. By the 3rd century before Christ, Rome had become the undisputed master of Italy. But as they looked out across the Mediterranean Sea, they encountered something they'd never faced before. An enemy that was everything they were, but older, richer, and seemingly more sophisticated. The great trading empire of Carthage controlled the western Mediterranean like it was their personal lake, and they had no intention of sharing that dominance with upstart Romans. Picture Carthage in its prime, a gleaming city on the North African coast where merchant ships from across the known world crowded the harbors. Carthaginian traders spoke a dozen languages, dealt in exotic goods from India and Britain, and had been mastering the seas for centuries before Rome was even a proper city. Their purple dyes were legendary, their silver mines in Spain seemed inexhaustible, and their naval technology was generations ahead of anything the Romans had ever seen. But here's what made this conflict so fascinating. These weren't just two cities fighting over territory. This was a clash between two completely different ways of organizing civilization. Carthage was a maritime empire built on trade networks and hired armies. Rome was a land-based power built on citizen soldiers and political alliances. They were like two different species of predator meeting in the same hunting ground for the first time. The first confrontation came in 264 before Christ over the island of Sicily. It should have been a short conflict. After all, what could land-based Romans possibly do against the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean? The answer turned out to be typically Roman. They decided to learn how to be sailors, and they decided to do it fast. Roman engineers studied captured Carthaginian ships like they were solving puzzles. They figured out how to build their own war galleys, but then they added something completely unexpected. A hinged bridge called a corvus that could drop onto enemy ships, turning sea battles into land battles where Roman soldiers could use their superior fighting skills. But the real test of Roman character came during the Second War with Carthage, when they faced a military genius who nearly ended their story before it could reach its climax. His name was Hannibal, and he was everything that should have terrified the Romans. Brilliant, ruthless, and creative enough to attempt something that everyone said was impossible. In 218 before Christ, Hannibal led an army from Spain across the Alps and into Italy itself. Think about what this meant to Romans who had never faced a foreign invasion on their own soil. Suddenly, enemy campfires were visible from Roman hilltops. Carthaginian cavalry was raiding Roman farms. The descendants of those mud hut dwellers were facing their worst nightmare, an enemy who could strike at the very heart of their power. The catastrophe reached its peak at a place called Cannae in 216 before Christ. Hannibal drew the Roman army into a trap so perfect that military academies still study it today. He let the Romans push forward into the center of his line, then wrapped around them from both sides like a closing fist. By the end of the day, nearly 70,000 Romans lay dead on the battlefield, including dozens of senators, hundreds of knights, and an entire generation of Rome's military leadership. Any other ancient city would have surrendered after Cannae. The logical thing to do would have been to negotiate, to accept Carthaginian dominance, to admit that Rome had reached the limits of its expansion. But here's where the Romans revealed something extraordinary about their national character. They simply refused to acknowledge that they had lost. Roman messengers rode to every allied city in Italy with the same message: "We are still fighting. We will never surrender. Stand with us." Most of those allies looked at the smoking ruins of Roman armies and decided to stay loyal anyway. Roman mothers sent their teenage sons to fill the gaps in the legions. Roman craftsmen worked day and night to forge new weapons and armor. But most incredibly of all, the Roman Senate made a decision that revealed the true genius of their system. They refused even to negotiate with Hannibal. When Carthaginian envoys arrived to discuss terms, the Romans wouldn't even let them enter the city. The message was clear: Rome doesn't make peace from a position of weakness, ever. What followed was one of the greatest displays of strategic patience in military history. While Hannibal won battle after battle in Italy, the Romans played a completely different game. They sent armies to Spain to cut off his supplies. They built new fleets to challenge Carthaginian control of the seas. They slowly, methodically began strangling the Carthaginian Empire at its roots. The Roman general who finally turned the tide was a young man named Scipio, who understood something crucial about Hannibal's strategy. The Carthaginian genius was unbeatable in Italy because he knew the terrain and could count on local support. But what if the Romans took the war to Africa, where Hannibal couldn't use those advantages? The climactic battle came at Zama in 202 before Christ, where Scipio faced Hannibal on African soil. It was like a chess match between two masters, but this time the Romans had learned all of Hannibal's tricks. They turned his own tactics against him, using disciplined formations and tactical flexibility to achieve what had seemed impossible. They defeated the greatest military mind of the ancient world. But here's what really shows Roman character. They didn't just want to win this war, they wanted to make sure they never had to fight it again. The peace terms they imposed on Carthage were designed to permanently cripple their naval power. Carthaginian ships were burned, their colonies were redistributed, and their ability to wage war without Roman permission was eliminated forever. Yet even this wasn't enough for some Romans. 50 years later, when Carthage had rebuilt itself as a peaceful trading city, there were Roman senators who argued that as long as Carthage existed, Rome could never be truly safe. The most famous of these was Cato the Elder, who ended every speech in the Senate with the same phrase, "Furthermore, I think Carthage must be destroyed." In 146 before Christ, the Romans found their excuse for a third war. This time, there would be no mercy, no negotiations, no second chances. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years, and when it finally fell, the Romans did something that shocked even their own allies. They destroyed the city completely. Every building was torn down, every artifact was carried away, and according to legend, they even salted the earth so nothing could grow there again. The destruction of Carthage marked the moment when Rome stopped being a regional Italian power and became something the ancient world had never seen, a truly global empire. With their greatest rival eliminated, Roman legions could march wherever they pleased. Roman governors began ruling provinces from Spain to Greece, from North Africa to Asia Minor. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Rome's victory over Carthage wasn't their military success, it was how they had transformed themselves in the process. They entered the conflict as a land-based Italian city-state and emerged as masters of the Mediterranean Sea. They had learned to build fleets, conduct overseas campaigns, manage distant provinces, and coordinate military operations across thousands of miles. The Romans had discovered their most devastating weapon, the ability to absorb any punishment, learn from any defeat, and come back stronger than before. Other empires conquered through superior technology or overwhelming numbers. Rome conquered through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible if they were willing to pay the price and take the time to figure it out. Standing in the ruins of Carthage, Roman commanders could look out across the Mediterranean and see Roman ships on every horizon, Roman colonies on every major island, Roman allies controlling every important trade route. The little trading post on the Tiber had become the center of the known world, and everyone, friend and enemy alike, was beginning to understand that there was no force on earth capable of stopping Rome's relentless expansion. The age of Roman dominance had begun, and it would reshape civilization for the next 6 centuries. But first, the Romans would have to learn the hardest lesson of all, that conquering the world was easy compared to the challenge of governing it wisely. By the 1st century before Christ, Rome's incredible success had created an unexpected problem. The very system that had made their rise possible was collapsing under the weight of their achievements. The Roman Republic had been designed to govern a city-state, not a world empire. And into this crisis stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with ambition, power, and the transformation of civilization itself, Julius Caesar. Picture Caesar in his prime, tall, charismatic, with the kind of magnetic presence that could fill a room just by entering it. He wasn't born into the highest ranks of Roman nobility, but he possessed something far more dangerous than inherited privilege. He had vision, and he had the intelligence to make that vision reality. Caesar understood something that his fellow senators couldn't grasp. The old Roman Republic was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. You couldn't run provinces from Britain to Egypt with a system designed for governing a single Italian city. The Senate spent months debating issues that required immediate decisions. Roman generals in distant lands waited for orders that took months to arrive. The machinery of government was grinding to a halt just when Rome needed it most. So Caesar did what Romans had always done when faced with an impossible situation. He improvised. As governor of Gaul, he spent 9 years conquering what we now call France, Belgium, and parts of Britain and Germany. But he wasn't just winning battles. He was creating something unprecedented, a professional army that was loyal to him personally rather than to the Roman state. His soldiers followed him because he made them rich, because he shared their dangers, and because he had this remarkable ability to make each man feel like a partner in something historically important. When Caesar's legions crossed rivers, Caesar was in the first boat. When they stormed enemy walls, Caesar was climbing alongside them. He knew his soldiers' names, their families' situations, their personal ambitions. The crisis came in 49 before Christ, when the Roman Senate, terrified of Caesar's growing power, ordered him to disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar faced a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of Western civilization: obey the Senate and probably face prosecution and exile, or march on Rome itself and become either its savior or its destroyer. Standing on the banks of a small river called the Rubicon, which marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy, Caesar made his decision. According to legend, he paused for a long moment, then said, "The die is cast," and led his army across. With that single step, he had declared war on the Roman Republic itself. What followed was a civil war that tore the Roman world apart. Caesar's enemies weren't just political rivals. They were some of Rome's greatest military minds, including Pompey, who had been Caesar's ally and friend. Battles were fought from Spain to Egypt, with Roman legions facing Roman legions in conflicts that broke the hearts of soldiers who found themselves fighting against men they had served alongside for decades. Caesar won, of course, but his victory came at an enormous cost. The Roman Republic that had conquered the Mediterranean world was shattered beyond repair. The Senate that had guided Rome for 5 centuries was reduced to a powerhouse that rubber-stamped Caesar's decisions. The citizen soldiers who had been the backbone of Roman expansion were increasingly replaced by professional armies loyal to their commanders rather than to Rome itself. And then, on the Ides of March in 44 before Christ, Caesar's story ended in the most Roman way possible, with a conspiracy of senators who believed they could save the Republic by eliminating the man who had destroyed it. They surrounded Caesar in the Senate House and struck him down with 23 wounds, each senator taking part in what they saw as a sacred act of liberation. But here's the fascinating irony. By killing Caesar, his assassins ensured that everything he had started would continue, but in the hands of someone far more ruthless and systematic than Caesar had ever been. Caesar's heir was a young man named Octavian, later known as Augustus, and he would complete the transformation that Caesar had begun. Augustus was everything that Caesar wasn't: careful, patient, and utterly pragmatic. Where Caesar had been flamboyant, Augustus was understated. Where Caesar had flaunted his power, Augustus disguised it. He understood that Romans would accept the reality of one-man rule as long as they could pretend that the Republic still existed. So Augustus performed one of the most brilliant political sleights of hand in history. He officially restored the Republic, giving back powers to the Senate and the people that everyone knew were meaningless. He refused grand titles, calling himself simply first citizen. But behind this modest facade, he quietly reorganized the entire Roman system to ensure that all real power flowed through him. The transformation was stunning. Augustus took Caesar's vision of Rome as a world empire and made it work systematically and permanently. He created the world's first professional civil service, with trained administrators who could run provinces efficiently regardless of local politics. He established a permanent military with standardized training, equipment, and retirement benefits. He built infrastructure on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until the industrial age. But perhaps most remarkably, Augustus transformed Rome itself from a city that still looked like an overgrown Italian town into something that could serve as the capital of the world. When he came to power, most of Rome's buildings were still made of brick and wood. When he died, the city gleamed with marble temples, massive public baths, theaters that could seat tens of thousands, and aqueducts that brought fresh water from mountains hundreds of miles away. This wasn't just construction, it was a statement about what Rome had become. Every visitor to the city would see immediately that this was the center of something unprecedented in human history. The Forum, where Caesar had been assassinated, was rebuilt as a complex of magnificent buildings that showcased the wealth and power of every Roman province. Streets were widened, sewers were improved, and public spaces were created where citizens could gather and feel proud of what their civilization had achieved. Augustus also solved a problem that had plagued Rome for centuries: how to maintain peace across such a vast territory. He created what historians call the Pax Romana, Roman peace, a system where local conflicts were settled through Roman law rather than warfare, where trade could flow freely across thousands of miles, and where different cultures could coexist under the umbrella of Roman citizenship. Think about what this meant for ordinary people living anywhere from Scotland to Syria. For the first time in human history, you could travel safely across continents, conduct business with people who spoke dozens of different languages, and know that the same legal system that protected you in Rome would also protect you in Egypt or Spain. Roman law became the foundation for legal systems that still influence us today, establishing principles like the presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, and the idea that laws should apply equally to all citizens. But Augustus's most lasting achievement wasn't any building or law. It was the way he managed to preserve the best elements of Roman culture while adapting them to the realities of governing a world empire. Romans could still feel proud of their republican traditions and their citizen-soldier heritage, even as they lived under what was essentially a very sophisticated monarchy. The calendar that Caesar had introduced, our modern calendar with its 12 months and leap years, became standard across the empire. Roman engineering techniques spread to every province, creating roads, bridges, and buildings that would outlast the empire itself. The Latin language became the foundation for what would eventually become Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Most importantly, Augustus created a system of government that was stable enough to survive weak emperors, foreign invasions, economic crises, and cultural transformations. The Roman Empire that he established would endure for another 4 centuries in the West and more than 1,000 years in the East, becoming the foundation for everything from the Catholic Church to the legal systems of modern Europe and America. When Augustus died in 14 after Christ, he had achieved something that even Caesar might not have thought possible. He had made Rome eternal, not in the sense that it would never fall, but in the sense that its influence would continue to shape human civilization long after the last Roman legion had marched and the last Roman emperor had abdicated. From those humble mud huts on the Palatine Hill to the marble palaces of the Caesars, Rome's journey was complete. They had started as survivors on a muddy riverbank and ended as the creators of Western civilization itself. The little trading post that had learned to turn enemies into allies, defeats into victories, and crises into opportunities had finally achieved its destiny. It had become the eternal city, the model that every subsequent empire would try to imitate, but none would ever surpass. So here we are, at the end of one of history's most incredible journeys. We started with a handful of mud huts on a riverbank, and we've watched them transform into marble palaces that ruled the known world. But as we step back and look at this entire saga, what can we really learn from Rome's extraordinary rise? The most striking thing about Rome's story isn't any single victory or brilliant leader. It's their uncanny ability to turn every crisis into a stepping stone. When neighboring tribes threatened them, they didn't just fight back. They figured out how to make those enemies want to become Romans. When their monarchy became corrupt, they didn't just replace one king with another. They invented an entirely new form of government. When Hannibal brought them to their knees, they didn't surrender. They learned his tactics and used them to conquer the world. Think about what this really means. The Romans weren't successful because they were naturally superior to everyone else, or because they had some secret weapon that nobody could match. They succeeded because they mastered something that most civilizations never learned: how to adapt without losing their identity, how to change without abandoning what made them strong in the first place. This is what makes Rome's story so relevant to us today. We live in a world that's changing faster than ever before, where the challenges we face, from technology to climate change to global conflicts, require exactly the kind of thinking that made Rome great. The ability to look at a problem and say, "This isn't just an obstacle. This is an opportunity to become something better than we were before." The Romans understood that survival isn't about avoiding change. It's about managing change wisely. They knew when to preserve their traditions and when to abandon them. They knew when to fight and when to negotiate. They knew when to lead and when to learn from others. Most importantly, they knew that their strength came not from their individual brilliance, but from their ability to work together toward common goals. But perhaps the most powerful lesson from Rome's rise is something that goes deeper than politics or military strategy. It's about the power of believing in something bigger than yourself. Those early Romans who defended their muddy settlement against impossible odds, the citizens who walked out of the city to demand fair laws, the soldiers who followed Caesar across the Rubicon, the administrators who built Augustus's empire. They all shared a vision of what Rome could become. They weren't just fighting for their own survival or personal gain. They were building something that would outlast their own lives, something that would benefit people they would never meet, in places they would never see. That sense of purpose, that commitment to a legacy larger than any individual lifetime, that's what transformed a trading post into an eternal city. And here's what's truly remarkable. Rome's influence never really ended. Every time you look at a calendar, you're seeing Caesar's legacy. Every time a court presumes someone innocent until proven guilty, you're witnessing Roman legal principles. Every time different cultures find ways to coexist peacefully, you're seeing echoes of the Pax Romana. The languages we speak, the governments we create, the very ideas we have about citizenship and law, they all carry traces of decisions made by people in togas 2,000 years ago. Rome wasn't built in a day, as the saying goes, and its lessons weren't learned in a day either. It took centuries of mistakes, victories, defeats, and adaptations to create the system that would influence human civilization for millennia. But the Romans never gave up on the fundamental belief that drove them from those first mud huts to the marble palaces, that with enough determination, creativity, and willingness to learn from others, any challenge can become an opportunity. So what do you think? As we face our own complex challenges in the 21st century, what can we learn from these ancient Romans who refused to accept that anything was impossible? How might their example of turning enemies into allies, defeats into victories, and crises into opportunities apply to the problems we're trying to solve today? The story of Rome reminds us that civilizations aren't built by avoiding difficulties. They're built by people who look at difficulties and ask, how can we use this to become stronger? That's a question worth thinking about, whether you're trying to understand the past or trying to shape the future. And speaking of the future, this is just one chapter in the incredible story of human civilization. There are so many other empires, so many other remarkable journeys from humble beginnings to world-changing influence. The Mongols who rode out of the steppes to create the largest land empire in history. The British who built a naval empire where the sun never set. The Islamic caliphates that preserved and advanced human knowledge through the Dark Ages. Each of these stories has its own lessons, its own moments of triumph and tragedy, its own insights into what makes civilizations rise and fall. If you've enjoyed discovering how a tiny trading post became the eternal city of Rome, imagine what we might learn from exploring how a small island nation came to rule the seas, or how nomadic horsemen created an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the patterns that shape human societies, the decisions that change the course of civilizations, and the lessons that can help us navigate our own challenges. Every great empire has something to teach us, whether it's about leadership, innovation, adaptation, or simply the incredible things that people can accomplish when they work together toward a common vision. If you admire history as much as we do, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, turn on notifications, and let us know which empire would you like to explore next. Which civilization's rise from humble beginnings to world power speaks to you? The choice is yours, and the journey through time continues. Until our next adventure into the fascinating world of history, keep wondering, keep learning, and keep discovering the amazing stories that shape the world we live in today.